Hello, my friends. This is John Edward Willie, and I am taking a walk, thinking aloud about a specific philosophical question, which is the question as to whether we are minds or bodies. Of course, many of us would suppose that perhaps we are a little bit of both. And in fact, many people go further and wonder as to what the relationship between these two entities, the body and the mind, might be. And so perhaps that itself is the question. What is the relation of mind and body? I'm here to defend two opposing points of view, one of which thinks of the mind almost as a kind of separate reality from the body, not merely as a kind of soul or a kind of self that's hidden within the brain, but as a conception of the mind perhaps that we're not quite used to articulating. What I mean to say is that it is possible to defend a point of view which is quite contrary to the typically scientific, often reductive, materialist view, which is that we are bodies alone and that we do not have minds, or our experience of having a mind is perhaps exactly that, a mere experience with no relation to the body itself. So what I'm meaning to suggest is that there are 2 points of view at play here, and there's an extreme and a less extreme version of each point of view. The idea that we have a mind, or that we are minds, philosophically begins to emerge in the works of Rene Descartes. And so I'm going to discuss a little bit of what Descartes had to say about the mind in the way that solidified a conception or almost a mythology of the mind that induced a larger effect, which is the very shape of our subjectivity, the very ways that we understand ourselves. Even if we reject the Cartesian idea of the mind as being separate from reality, we are in many ways still living out the conceptual influence of such an idea, meaning that the very experience of, say, alienation, that is feeling like you really don't belong where you're at, that you don't have a place or a home where you're at, or the feeling of depression, extreme depression, which often has to do with a kind of rejection of the self, which is experienced to be alien and other. These, as common experiences, which are negative experiences, I posit are in many ways the outcome of the 16th, 17th century French philosopher Rene Descartes, who pioneered an idea of who we were as being what can be called cogitos, which is a way of saying that who you are is a self-thinking substance. That is, what you are is not something that's reducible to the body or understood merely as a function of the body, but as something that is able to operate in a way wherein it can uncover transparent, analytical relations to the world around it. That's in many ways my crude, perhaps bad version of what Descartes is doing. And there are, in fact, already many YouTube videos about precisely what Descartes was doing. But what I'm wanting to do is to trace out this influence as being a conception of the mind, as something that is not merely an escapist point of view. It's not merely that Descartes defended the idea of there being a self or a substance separate from reality because he wanted to believe it. It's because he began with the very experience that we have in the narrowness of everyday life, which is the experience of being something like a subject operating within an objective world. And so on a scientific and economical level, Descartes had a fundamental influence in the kind of control and mastery and understanding of the world that we have universally. And the very fundamental influence that Descartes had on science and economics and politics and psychology was positing us as being separate from the world around us in the form of being a subject in an objective world. And what this unlocked was an extraordinary power that we in fact have when we begin thinking of the world in a kind of grid. That is, through a kind of graph, which in many ways parallels Cartesian algebra and calculus, insofar as we begin to understand that in reducing the world to a certain number of moving parts or pieces that can be mathematized, we can in fact exert an extraordinary power over the world. So I'm saying two things about the influence of Descartes on our subjectivity and on the mind as we conceptualize it. But I'm also trying to say something about the almost, dare I say, common sense in the dualism of Descartes. Because in fact, in many ways, one is removing what is perhaps what is most human in oneself in removing subjectivity. And so this attempt to displace subjectivity, to displace Descartes, is in fact the first move of many ways of thinking in philosophy and outside of philosophy. And so it's more common to reject Descartes than it is to begin with the affirmation of what he's doing. That is, to begin with wrestling with why we still read Descartes, why we still study Descartes, why we still think of him as being a part of the conversation. I think that has to be grasped, because what's happening fundamentally in Descartes is he's attempting to save what he thinks of as vitally important, which is, from his point of view, in the 16th century, as a French Jesuit, as the first rationalist, as this figure who's sort of looming between the late Renaissance and early modernity and the Enlightenment, that is René Descartes, who's, like many, straddling the world between the alchemical and the astrological and the rational and the astronomical and the mechanical. Descartes is one of those transformative figures through which our world wouldn't be what it is without. And so the thing, though, from his point of view, that I'm meaning to insist upon is a defense of a kind of autonomy. So Descartes is to be rejected perhaps intellectually because he doesn't live up to any of the standards that sort of begin almost after him. They begin with Spinoza, who's perhaps a generation after Descartes. But that in itself, that is, to begin with the critique of Descartes, to begin with the rejection of him, or the attempt to explain him away, is in many ways a rejection of our own experienced autonomy as beings who are capable of making decisions and who are capable of thinking about themselves as beings in a world who have a detached separation from themselves and the world. Of course, I'm a naturalist, I'm a physicalist, I'm a materialist, of course, modified, reconstructed in more than many ways. But I begin with the paralyzing recognition, which is perhaps startling to many people, and I think maybe it's so simple that a lot of people would really overlook this point and not really see how important it is. The very Republican, democratic structures that our political world is nestled within depend upon a conception of people as being able to function as, at least on a momentary basis, as rational Cartesian creatures. In other words, liberalism in many ways depends upon a kind of fantasy or a kind of existence with which Descartes was articulating. And so to reject Descartes, whether from a Heideggerian point of view or Foucault or critical theory or a Marxist point of view or a biological Darwinian point of view, which are all of the things that I bring to the table, is not the same thing as rejecting Descartes fundamentally, because clearly there's some kind of gap in our intelligibility. There's some kind of gap within our totalized understanding of the world. If we include what is political and what is scientific, as well as what we experience, we constantly find that there are schisms, that there are ruptures, that there are breaks, there are gaps in human intelligibility. So a gap in human intelligibility is perhaps my favorite subject, This is what the Greeks call aporia, which fundamentally to me means a kind of horizon. The aporetic is a thought beyond which we cannot think, because what the aporetic represents isn't the collapse of meaning itself, but the recognition that between all of these areas of human understanding that we have, which are increasing day by day, there isn't something like dark matter, intellectually speaking. There's something like dark matter in regards to the vast spaces between what we do understand. Because this has to be understood that this is not a defense of like relativism per se, or a defense of the idea that we know nothing, that humans know nothing. Clearly, we know many things, perhaps some more than others. But what I'm emphasizing is that what in biological and physical sciences, or at least the philosophy of science, is sometimes called emergent properties. And of course, this can be understood in many ways, and I'm probably misunderstanding it from a technical point of view. But emergent properties to me isn't a quality of existence, but a mystery of existence, meaning that we do understand in a cosmological sense the origin of the universe, and we understand the fundamentals of physics and many other things. We understand chemistry, we understand biology, we understand geology, and in fact we understand much of human history. We understand our own family history, we understand our own nation states, and perhaps we understand something about the immediate future that is emerging. The point in the question regarding emergent properties has to do with the relation between these phenomenon as such. That is, questions are being raised in science and the philosophy of science and contemporary epistemology. Questions are being raised about whether we can be so sure. Can we really be so confident as to assume, for instance, that chemistry is layered upon physics? That is, everything in the world of chemistry and chemicals can be explained purely through underlying physical processes. The idea of the underlying, the spatial term, being fundamental. And it follows, of course, is the biological merely reducible to the chemical, and so forth. If you're following my train of thought, you begin to wonder, and I think not only wonder, but begin to see in our own experience these gaps that exist, at least intellectually. They're not gaps in reality, but they're gaps in our own understanding that could be understood to be aporetic. That is, they have to do with the ignorance we have, perhaps the necessary ignorance, the disavowal that we have towards the things that do not fit into our understanding. And when you begin to pay attention, you begin to fathom the degree to which so much of our experience is not intelligible. Of course, when we think, we're often playing a game where we comfortably reduce the world to a set of abstractions. That is, we turn the world into a kind of cartoon, not because there are not patterns, not because there are not explanations that we do not have, but we are forever already giving in to the taste that we have for comprehension. And on the other hand, this isn't a mystical defense of the irrational. This isn't an attempt to say that we know nothing, because that in itself is a superficial way of making a superficial statement. What I'm meaning to suggest here is that the question at hand, the mind-body problem, that is, the relation between the mind and the body, is a quintessential philosophical example of the non-intelligible, of the unintelligible. Meaning that we often assume, especially anti-intellectual people, assume that if there is a question, that we will answer it at some point in the future. Or they believe that if there is a question, it's not a real question. That is, if it can't be explained through a process of experiment and verification, then it cannot be understood as a question as such. And as a devotee of Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, I can certainly understand the degree to which perhaps all philosophical questions are without real merit. Perhaps they are mere plays on words and have no validity. But I think when you consider the relation between the mind and the body, not in a superficial way, but in a thorough kind of philosophical way, and more than that, not only when you think through the problem, but when you begin to feel in your bones this problem, then I think you begin to discover in everyday life the aporetic, that is, this gap in our intelligibility. Because what I mean to say is that it's not merely that the idea that we have minds can be defended and that's not reducible to the physical. We are in fact brains. That's the position I begin with, meaning that we are bodies, meaning that I begin with something like a Darwinian starting point. And it's not that people don't understand Darwin, but very, very few people have actually caught up to Darwin. That is, very few people, perhaps including myself, have really caught up in their mental and existential lives the actual consequences of Darwin's thinking, of Darwin's science. That is, very few people realize that no one has ever had a thought outside of their brain. Not a single person has ever imagined something or said something that wasn't a function of their bodies. That is, we begin with one world. Now, Descartes and many others who believe in minds have no trouble believing in minds or some kind of spiritual self, because they don't believe what I believe. They believe in two worlds. They believe that there's a world outside of this one, or an invisible world within this one. I don't begin with that starting point. I begin with the thought that all thoughts are actually chemical reactions in the brain. That is, I begin with what could perhaps be understood to be epiphenomenalism. However, I'm not an epiphenomenalist per se, but epiphenomenalism is a crucial thought because it has to do with the possibility that our entire mental life and the entire human life itself is merely a function of the brain. So the epiphenomenal, as a theory of what consciousness is an expression of the oftentimes scientific or naturalist view of who we are. And I don't share this. However, I do have many affinities with it because I don't see the mind as something that's operating outside of the brain. I think of that as being impossible. However, I find it also impossible, and this is where the aporetic, the aporia emerges, I find it also impossible that I can understand myself merely as a reductive set of chemical, physical, biological, historical forces. Because I don't merely bring up Descartes because I believe in the cogito or think that it really has any place at a serious discussion. I think, though, the experience that we all have as autonomous, free-thinking people is something that has to be reconstructed as something worth preserving. And I brought this up before in my video about free will and determinism. And that's in many ways another example of the aporetic, of a gap in human unintelligibility. That is, gaps of unintelligibility exist within our very conception of whether we are free beings or whether we are determined. There is really no answer to that, and yet there's no way of dismissing the question either. The question is always already a part of our everyday discussions that we're having in regards to the underlying assumptions and the tacit pre-agreements that we make without realizing that we're making about who we are and about what reality is. So to ask this question, is it merely to ask a question that is abstract and speculative? That is, do we have free will, or are we minds, or are we bodies? This is to ask a question that has to do with the interplay in our lives regarding what counts as a choice, or what counts as something that we should praise, or whether we should forget about our bodies perhaps because we are pure minds, as some people understand, or perhaps we should forgo the mental life, forgo any interiority whatsoever because we think of ourselves as merely being animals. So that gap in intelligibility has to do also with what I think of as the fundamental dialectic. And that dialectic I brought up before because I believe in it as having to do with the nature of the monologue or thinking within us when we're thinking. I don't think of the dialectic as being something historical or something that exists between two people. In fact, I think when two people are having a good conversation, what's happening is what I call the trialectic, which is that ideas are truly coming to life as living, breathing entities through the performative utterances of two people engaging in a free-floating experimental conversation. The dialectic, however, I think of as being a term which refers to what John Keats referred to as negative capability. John Keats, the poet, mentions negative capability as being the ability to sustain one or two or three different ideas in our mind without attempting to resolve them, without attempting to simply have one idea because that makes us feel comfortable, because we feel safe. We attempt to deal with the possibility that not only do we have a point of view, but that other people have a point of view. That's the dialectic. It means to operate as much as one can with the energy and time one has in a way within which one is not reducing the world to one point of view or another, but attempting to use one's actual biological imagination as a way of wrestling with the otherness of other people, as well as the otherness within ourselves that has to do with thinking about things in a way that doesn't merely reduce them to being, oh, everything is deterministic, or oh, we are just bodies, but keeping alive, not for its own sake, but keeping alive the recognition that not only does every idea basically explode into its own limitations, that is, not only does every idea, when we think it through, when we live it through, in many ways lead back into its own opposite, it oftentimes sort of explodes within itself. And there's a strange kind of dance that happens within the gravity, the shared gravity between two large ideas. And that is, for instance, in a way that's not related to these conversations, but is another example of the dialectic, has to do with what we think of as justice, right? Like what counts as right or wrong. One simple way of thinking about what counts as right or wrong, or what counts as justice, is not to divide or balkanize or falsely separate the questions, but to honestly ask yourself how it is that we exist in the world. And therefore, perhaps to see, at least from my philosophical point of view, we are operating in a way that is deontological with other people in our immediate life. That is, we can practice a kind of tenderness, a kind of closeness with people that has nothing to do with public life. In fact, when we're thinking of the social world, we can no longer think in terms of tenderness or subjectivity with others. That is, we can no longer give ourselves to everyone at once in the way that we do give everything at once to a single person that we have to be interacting with. That is, we move, when we're thinking of the socially, from the deontological, from the tenderness that we can give to other people, towards what is effectively a managerial way of thinking about the social world. That is, some people think of justice and leadership perhaps as being the kind of pillars with which we should think about the social world. And so for some people, that operates as a kind of dualism that allows their dialectic to operate. In fact, when you think about how many people live in the world, they're often oscillating between the kind of preciousness and the kind of non-teleological attention that we can give to like family members or our close friends. And then when we go out into public life, or when we're thinking about politics, all of that falls apart. We no longer have a systematic, totalized vision of reality that can somehow carry the sentimental capacity we have to live with our own heart. I don't mean sentimental in a negative way, but I mean the basic sympathy. Sympathy is a better word for the natural human tendency we have to feel for others. And in fact, what they call mirror neurons, and are parts of our brain that mirror the experience of others and give us what's called sympathy. And so it's been proven biologically, in fact, to be a part of our very experience, which is that the mirror neurons in our brain almost holographically experience what other people are experiencing in a way that gives us something more than what Descartes and many others think of as a strictly subjective experience, meaning that subjective experience perhaps includes the otherness of other people. And so what that means, in lieu of the question of justice, but also in lieu of the question of minds and bodies, as well as the question of free will and determinism, is the apparatic the aporia within the dialectic, meaning that the reason that we are keeping alive multiple ideas isn't for its own sake, but because there's in fact a horizon within our own experience about free will and determinism, our body and the mind, and social public life, and the kind of private life that we have. And so I think that I brought it up before, but it's important to say that when one is wanting to classify things separately, when one is wanting to grant a different logic to different parts of our experience, that is perhaps in a very different way to think about art. The way that we look at art, or the way that we make about art, is not being the same logic or the same project as the political or as the ethical. We then begin to discover another kind of gap in intelligibility between the aesthetic and the political. And so the superficial way to think about this is the way that unfortunately most people do think about it, because many people are very superficial insofar as they grant a scientific view when it fits what they want to believe, but they're also a spiritual religious person when that fits them and it allows them to believe what they want to believe. And so this is superficial. This is what I call syncretic. And it's a superficial, perhaps kish way of pasting together a bunch of beliefs and calling it a worldview. It's superficial. Unfortunately, it's the most common view. The view that I'm defending that's not syncretic, but is synoptic. The synoptic view is one that defends an organic, experimental, inside-out development of a view of the world that doesn't force everything into a schematic kind of prison. It doesn't force everything into pre-categorized ways of thinking that force things to be what we think it should be. So the synoptic, in fact, operates in a way that, as I brought up, as being dialectic within itself, but dialectic that has almost nothing to do with Hegel and almost nothing to do with Plato, except that to use that very word is to pay tribute to them, except that I am in many ways their reconstructed heir. So I am Plato's progeny. And so my very use of the trialectic, on the other hand, is sort of my own attempt to rescue what I think of as the formalism of ideas. The formalism of ideas has to do with the idea that Plato himself comes alive when two people are discussing Plato in such a way that honors and pays tribute not only to his critical insights, but also to his creative play. And so I think of what happens when two people are speaking about the mind-body problem as having almost less to do with the problem and more to do with the degree to which we're opening up another kind of space within which the question almost becomes its own kind of entity and begins to speak in ways that opens up without explaining away the very riddle and enigma of human experience, which I think of as philosophy as attempting to envelop, to keep alive. And so perhaps that's why I'm kind of making these recordings, like as ways of keeping alive and preserving, almost in a kind of amber, my own thinking, my own thoughts at this moment and in this time. On a Monday, my day off between double shifts, when other people are planning out their activities, I'm often embarrassed to admit what it is that I do for fun, which is to exist in a state of grace, intellectual grace, to exist in a state of contemplation that isn't mere laziness, but is in fact the whole point of life. As Aristotle had said, the point of life ultimately is contemplation. And of course, Aristotle understood that that wasn't going to be democratic, that some people would have more or less the power and therefore the opportunity and therefore the leisure to participate in philosophical contemplation. But I think in our world we have to fight to the teeth for this leisure. Politically, this is called negative freedom. We have to fight to free ourselves from anything that's holding us back or stopping us, not from doing what we want to do, not from pursuing our own dreams, although that perhaps is the end of many people. I think the very opportunity or so-called positive freedom that a person is lucky enough to earn for themselves has to do with existing in a kind of contemplative space, which really to others appears to be thinking about nothing. But this is the very space in which I find myself so much nurtured, so much replenished, that I come back to other people reborn. You know, even as a secular atheist heathen, I find myself resonating with Paul's injunction that one must die daily. And so I think of philosophizing, at least when I'm on my own, when I don't have the opportunity to talk to my favorite people and my lovely friends, as being something that I do on my own, not merely as a kind of duty or discipline, but as a kind of celebration of the kind of surplus which comes with a deep intellectual life. Not that one is attempting to be serious or attempting to be intellectual, but one is attempting to attend to the mystery of human experience. And the mystery of human experience isn't merely a feeling or an experience, so much as a cognitive experience. That is, that cognitive experience has to do with seeing the very apparatic quality of our lives. For instance, if we think of ourselves merely as brains that have thoughts and nothing more, well, then perhaps we're rejecting the idea that thoughts can influence the body. You know, that's a mystery. Epiphenomenalism says that everything is determined, and every thought we have and every feeling we have and all of our imagination has no relation to reality. Of course, it has a relation to reality, but it's not what we think it is. It's not what we think our experience is. Epiphenomenalism, in many ways, fails to recognize not the fact, but the experience of the influence of the mind on the body. And this is a huge starting point for the consideration that many people already take seriously about the way that the mind can influence the body, or the way that the mind can influence reality. And so, without taking a position, I defend the mystery itself, which is the possibility that even in being brains, even in being animals, there is a relation which is circular, which is twofold, a relationship which is not merely outward, meaning that the thoughts that we have, the feelings that we have, affect our bodies. There are a lot of people who, under incredible duress, who through emergencies, and many people who through incredible illness, incredible, overwhelming illness and devastation, have made the claim that their mind, that their thoughts, that their attitude, their disposition had an influence on their health and their survival and their vitality. Who am I to contend or judge that? I prefer to preserve the mystery itself, which is a mystery that prevents us, I think, from being reductivist, that prevents us from being epiphenomenalist, that prevents us from being, not that epiphenomenalism isn't perhaps in many ways a scary, perhaps true alternative theory of what human consciousness is, but I think that to do that is to forget why Descartes could have been doing what he was doing if he was thinking from our point of view, which is attempting to rescue the experience that we have of being what we are, even if we change the word from mind to brain. You know, there's a fundamental problem, and this was the problem that when I was 19 years old locked me into philosophy for life. And it was the question that I now understand to be the relation between the first person and the third person points of view. Meaning that the way that I understood this at the time was that no matter how much scientifically we understood a particular animal, like a cat, no matter how exhaustively and thoroughly we researched and comprehended the complexity of the cat, we would never know what it was like to be a cat. That is, there's a fundamental gap between what it is like to be something and the objective explanation that we have of that thing. And that in itself is at the heart of the mind-body problem. It's the kind of difficulty that we have in subsuming all of our experience to an objective understanding. Because what we need, when we consider what's called the qualia, which is the actual experience that we have, the qualia being sometimes called the phenomenological experience that we have, that in itself cannot even be classified symbolically. That is, it doesn't even fit into the arena within which we practice rational, intelligible understandings. And that's why, in no small way, literature and art, and so much of what is so valuable to us and so important to us really sits so far outside of not only academia, but so far out of the way that we typically think reality is. And so that's partially an explanation as to why so many really, really smart people, really brilliant people, have such vast gaps in their own understanding, especially regarding often human nature, their own nature, the nature of reality. And in paying attention to this nature, the thing that I am wanting to attend to is the manifold, multifarious quality of people and things, situations, and experiences, all of which demand something that goes so deep within us that we could almost have no explanation of or no comprehension of, but it's something within us that is working everything out. And the epiphenomenal as an idea is in many ways a tribute to that. But that's perhaps, as I've said, to miss the very nature of being something that is in the world that has a point of view, that has a subjectivity. Our subjectivity cannot be reduced to objectivity. You will never comprehend another person's experience, and that may include your own experience. And what I'm pointing at is the limitations of physicalism, the horizon through which what many people who think of themselves, who fancy themselves to be rational, scientific people, what they really fail to see is the degree to which consciousness itself is a mystery, that our experience is not something that can be satisfactorily reduced to a simple explanation. And a part of that has to do with the fact that we are the very things that are asking the question. And that's also why I think that it's false, but very common, to think of Descartes and the cogito and the idea of the mind as being a substance that's separate from, that it's a entity separate from substance, from reality. Why this isn't merely displaced by the scientific and industrial revolutions. In fact, these generations for 4 centuries who came after Descartes really continued on the mental life of Descartes in thinking of the world in the way that he did. All the while their sciences and other ways of thinking began to discover that, in fact, there isn't a self that is separate from the self. This scientific revolution is in no way the opposite of Descartes. It's in no way as free from Descartes. So what I posit is that the great majority of people who, when they think about it, dismiss Descartes are in fact the living embodiment and living examples of Cartesian thinking. And the reason that I bring this up is I think that Descartes really finds his vector in Martin Heidegger, that it's Heidegger's rejection of his mentor Husserl, Heidegger's rejection of Husserl's methodology and phenomenology is in fact the beginning point of recognizing what it means to be a material being, what it means to be a physical being. So that's also why, in many ways, I'm interested in not only the defense and the attempt to understand what it means to think of us as being minds that are separate from brains, because the relation between minds and brains is something that no one can explain, even if they believe that they're separate. For instance, if you believe in a soul, you can't explain the relation between the soul and the body. And so merely to insist that it exists in some way is merely to evade the very problem itself. And yet this is easy enough to say, this is easy enough to see, especially since it's really common to reject the idea of dualism. It's of perhaps much more benefit to defend it for a little while, to see what it might look like to try on the idea that we are minds. And perhaps there's something to be said for that I could make another video about. But I think it's also a more advantage to ask questions of those who insist that reality is merely a bunch of shit and that we are just animals who are living out fantasy worlds and that there's no point trying, there's no point thinking. What I'm wanting to do is bring Parisia, begin the critique, bring the questioning to them, to the self-satisfied ones among us who really ultimately undermine experience. And undermine is a key word. It's a word that is used in a slightly different way by the philosopher Graham Harman, who is a Heideggerian thinker. And what he's suggesting when he uses the word undermine is that we are not overmining. That in fact, anything we think about, whether it's an object, whether it's ourselves, whether it's an event, or whether it's an imaginary idea, we're oscillating between the simplest, most reductive explanation that we can come up with, which is often the kind of explanation that has to do with things merely being explainable as being functions of chemical events, as being functions of physical events. And this is not the same thing as another way of operating in relation to objects and people and things, which Harman refers to as overmining. And overmining has to do with the fact that the very meaning or the very organic, holistic way within which we're in the world is always fluctuating between various ways of understanding how objects fit into our world. So when you begin to think about how things fit into our world or how things can exist otherwise, then you begin to see the narrowness as well as the mystery within which we're trying to keep alive a non-reductive approach to either the body or the mind. That is an approach which keeps alive the complexity and difficulty, in fact, the torment of our experience, which is one that in many ways sometimes wants to believe that it's something it's not, which many people want to believe they are not. That is to believe that they are something that is outside of reality, outside of themselves, that will live after their own death or that comes from before their own death. That is, there are many people who also want to believe that all of that is completely nonsense and that we are just bodies and that we are just animals and that all of experience is merely an illusion. What I'm positing as being the real strength that we have is to recognize the fact that these two ideas exist together. And the way they exist together is in the body itself. It's in our experience. It's our very experience where we are contending with the difficulty in this relationship. And it's quite fascinating on a day-to-day basis simply to think about or to look at the ways that we talk to ourselves, the ways that we think about ourselves. For instance, this is a commonly used example, but we say that I moved my hand. But that's a mistaken way of thinking because you are your hand moving. That is, we're often positing a separate kind of reality that doesn't really exist because we're living out the sort of influence of the power of Cartesian thinking. That is, we're living out the very weaknesses of the strengths that come with being able to think about the world, at least for a moment, as being a subject-object divide, to think about the world as being containing the mind and bodies is something that offers a particular outcome. But I think when we fail to see that it offers almost nothing else, that's like to miss the point of life itself. And so this is not the kind of position that I think anyone else has in regards to this question, because my point is not merely to make the question clear, to open up the question, but to not play this kind of game where I'm pretending to be neutral, where I'm pretending to not have a point of view. There's so much of that already exists on YouTube. What I'm attempting to do is to live up to what I think of as being the key part of both Plato and Wittgenstein, and that is philosophy as a process. That is, philosophy is alive only so far as you and I are thinking philosophically. And so to keep these ideas alive, to keep alive the question of the mind and the body, is more fundamental to me than resolving the question. But it isn't for its own sake, even if there is a kind of entertainment value to it. But I'm John Edward Willie, and you know I love making these videos. Let me know what other questions you think I might begin approaching.